There's a conversation that happens a lot around the age of 42, 45, maybe 48. It happens quietly, usually alone, usually late at night. You open your retirement account, maybe for the first time in a while, and you look at the number, and then you close it. Not because you have a plan, not because you've decided to deal with it later. You close it because something in you just can't go there right now. And here's what's strange about that moment. You're not someone who avoids hard things. You've handled difficult jobs, difficult relationships, difficult years. You're not financially naive. You understand that compound interest exists, that time matters, that you probably should have started sooner. You know all of this, and yet the account gets closed, the tab gets switched, and you go back to whatever you were doing before, carrying this low-grade financial dread that never quite goes away, but never quite gets addressed either. That's not procrastination. That's not laziness. That has a name. And once you understand what's actually happening, the paralysis starts to make a different kind of sense. Now, here's the thing. Most financial content gets completely wrong about this. It treats retirement avoidance as an information problem. Like if you just understood the math better or watched one more explainer video, you'd suddenly get motivated and start maxing out your 401k. But that's not how any of this works. Information is not the bottleneck here. You already know you need to save more. You've known that for years. The problem isn't knowledge. The problem is a psychological state that makes action feel impossible regardless of what you know. Psychologists call it a specific kind of anticipatory grief. Not grief over something you've lost. Grief over a future you're afraid you've already lost access to. And the brain responds to that kind of threat the same way it responds to any threat. It protects you from it. It does that by making the thing feel too overwhelming to look at directly. By filling you with a vague sense of dread every time the topic comes up. By generating a dozen smaller, more manageable tasks that suddenly feel urgent every time you sit down to think about your finances. This isn't weakness. This is your nervous system doing exactly what it was designed to do. The problem is that the mechanism built to protect you from predators is now protecting you from your own retirement account. There's also something else happening, and it's a little more specific to this particular decade of life. Psychologists who study identity and aging have a name for what happens in your 40s and 50s. They call it the recognition of temporal finitude, which is just an academic way of saying, at some point in your 40s, your brain genuinely grasps for the first time that time is not infinite. And that realization isn't just philosophical, it's visceral. It changes how you experience every long-term plan, every future projection, every retirement calculator that asks you to think about yourself 25 years from now. Here's what that actually feels like in practice. Before your 40s, retirement is a concept. It's far away. It's abstract. It's something future you will handle. But somewhere in your early to mid-40s, retirement stops being a concept and starts being a countdown. And that shift is deeply disorienting. Because the person you used to be, the one who had plenty of time, no longer exists. And the person looking at that retirement account balance is suddenly doing the math and realizing the gap between where they are and where they thought they'd be by now is bigger than they expected. And that gap does something specific to the brain. There's a concept in psychology called the sunk cost emotion. Not the classic sunk cost fallacy about throwing good money after bad, but the emotional cousin of it. The feeling that because you didn't do the thing earlier, starting now means confronting everything you didn't do. And that confrontation is so painful that the brain finds it easier to not look at all, to keep the tab closed, to let the dread just sit there, unaddressed. Because addressing it means admitting what it costs you to have waited. Now here's where conventional financial advice makes the situation actively worse. The standard playbook for retirement content is show people a chart of compound interest, calculate how much they've lost by starting late, and tell them to start immediately. and the intention behind that approach is fine. But the psychological effect is devastating, because what that advice actually does is confirm the fear. It says, yes, you're behind. Here's exactly how behind you are. Now act. And instead of motivating action, it triggers what psychologists call the ostrich effect, the documented behavioral tendency to avoid information that might be painful. The more the information confirms the fear, the stronger the impulse to close the tab. This is why the people who most need retirement information are often the least likely to engage with it. It's not that the information isn't out there. It's that the way the information is presented activates the exact psychological defense mechanism that makes action impossible. The finance industry keeps trying to solve a motivation problem with more math, and it keeps not working. Think about what happens to your nervous system when someone shows you a chart proving you've already lost tens of thousands of dollars in compound growth. It doesn't create urgency. It creates shutdown. And a person in shutdown doesn't open investment accounts. They open Netflix. So what actually helps? What does it look like to address this in a way that doesn't make the paralysis worse? The first thing, and this sounds simple, but it isn't, is separating the act of looking from the act of deciding. One of the reasons the tab gets closed is because opening the account feels like a commitment to do something about what you find. And that commitment, made in the abstract, feels overwhelming. So the brain treats looking itself as dangerous. But here's the reframe. Looking is not deciding. Looking is just information. You don't have to have a plan when you open the account. You don't have to know what to do next. You're just collecting data. That's it. And for a lot of people, giving themselves explicit permission to look without obligation is the thing that finally lets them look. The second thing is understanding that the gap between where you are and where conventional advice says you should be is almost certainly not as meaningful as it feels. Here's something the retirement industry doesn't talk about enough. The $1.5 million retirement number, or whatever arbitrary benchmark is currently circulating, was not calculated with your specific life in mind. It was built on assumptions about spending, lifestyle, health, family structure, and investment returns that may have very little to do with your actual situation. The number that matters is your number, not the generic one, and your number almost certainly looks different and more reachable than the one that's been making you feel behind. Your number accounts for what you actually spend, what you actually own, what Social Security will actually contribute, and what kind of life you actually want to live. That number, your real number, is almost always less frightening than the one you've been quietly carrying around. And knowing it, actually knowing it, is the first real financial act of the entire process. The third thing is arguably the most important. You have to address the identity piece, because a lot of the paralysis isn't just about money. It's about who you thought you'd be by now. There's a version of yourself that you had in mind at 30. The one who would have things figured out, would be on track, would have made the smart moves. And confronting the retirement account sometimes means confronting the distance between that person and the person you actually are. That gap is not a financial gap. It's a self-concept gap. And no amount of financial planning addresses it. What addresses it is recognizing that the story you're telling yourself about being behind is just that, a story. It's not a fact. It's a narrative your brain constructed to make sense of a complicated history. And it is not the same thing as your actual financial reality. Here's the thing I want you to sit with. The paralysis you feel around retirement isn't a sign that you're incapable of handling this. It's a sign that you care about it enough that it genuinely scares you. That fear is information. It's telling you that this matters to you. That financial security in the second half of your life is something you want, not something you've given up on. And that's actually a better starting point than indifference. The goal this week isn't to solve your retirement. It isn't to overhaul your finances or calculate the perfect contribution rate or figure out the optimal asset allocation. The goal is to open the account, look at the number, let it be whatever it is, and just notice what happens when you allow yourself to look at it without immediately trying to fix it or run from it. Notice whether the number is actually as catastrophic as the dread suggested, because for most people, it isn't. Notice whether you feel the familiar urge to close it, and then choose not to, just this once. That pause, that one moment of staying, is the beginning of a completely different relationship with your financial future. Not because you figured everything out in one sitting, but because you proved to yourself that looking is survivable. Because the path forward doesn't start with the right financial strategy. It starts with being willing to see where you actually are. If this landed in a way that felt different from the usual retirement content, subscribe. Every week, we dig into the psychology behind money and why we make the financial decisions we do. And drop a comment. What's the one financial thing you keep meaning to look at but haven't? I'd genuinely like to know.